All right, it is 2 o'clock, so I suggest we get started. I'm sure that a few more people will join us in a little bit. But this is the DGRAV seminar. My name is Thomas Baumgart. I'm happy to host our seminar this afternoon. Before we get started, just 3 quick announcements. So the first one is I would like to remind everybody of the code of conduct. In a nutshell, that just means that we'll treat each other in a friendly way, respectful and professional. Also, I would like to remind everybody of the DGRAV membership. So to borrow today's titled talk, I would argue DGRAV plus DAP is fine too. So even if you're a DAP member, please sign up for DGRAV too. Okay, actually, DGRAV's status as a division hinges on the membership numbers, so everybody counts. So basically, please sign up yourself, encourage your students, dogs, cats, all of that would be great. Now, finally, before we get started, we'll have 2 talks. Dan is going to give the first talk, and then Amanda will give the second talk, roughly 15 minutes and then 30 minutes. We ask you to keep your questions until the very end when we have a Q&A session, unless there's some burning questions really important to just clarify maybe some misunderstandings that help for the rest of the talk. So then in that case, raise your hand or type your question into the chat box. That will be fine. So to get started, our first speaker today is Dan Holz. It's a great pleasure to have you here. Dan is at the University of Chicago, and if my counting is right, this is actually your 3rd stint at the University of Chicago. After receiving an undergrad degree from Princeton, you were a graduate student at Chicago, then you had postdocs at AEI in Santa Barbara, then another one in Chicago, then another postdoc at Los Alamos until returning to Chicago, and I think in 2011, where you've been a professor ever since. Dan is well known for all of his work, and it has been awarded with many prizes, including the Kavli Fellowship of the National Academy of Sciences. So it's our great pleasure to have you both of you here today and tell us about DGRAV Minus DAP.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. That's a very nice introduction. And yeah, it's really fun to be doing this. And full disclosure, so I have just stepped down from the chair line of DAP. So I'm okay doing this. I was not okay last year. That would have been really bad form, but now forget DAP, back to DGRAV. No, anyway, we'll explain. Both DGRAV and DAP are good. And part of the message of this talk is simply for the things we want to do, a lot of the DAP details are not relevant. And so I'll try to kind of give an overview of that, and then Amanda will kind of get into the details of some of the work she's done along these lines. So I figure to start, I'm just going to kind of set the stage and remind, I'm assuming we don't have an expert LIGO audience, and I'm going to kind of give the broad view of where we're at with LIGO, and then kind of lead in from there. So let's go. So off we go. So LIGO, hold on, let me just, okay. LIGO has been observing and just finished its 3rd observing run, actually a few years ago, but that's kind of the most recent public catalog data. And
Daniel, I'm so sorry. I think you were not seeing the presenter view, and I think you're probably talking about your slide number 2. But we can only see slide number 1.
Okay, hold on. So what are you seeing now?
I'm seeing slide number 1 with like in like
window.
notes.
Okay, all right.
Not like the presenter view.
Thanks, Amanda.
It's still in Keynote, but
yeah,
maybe
I'm gonna just see if I can do this. Hold on. Why is this not? I'm just gonna mirror. No, okay, hold on.
sometimes you need to share like your whole desktop with Keynote instead of sharing like the Keynote application.
Yeah. So we'll try that. Okay. Now let's see. Okay, better? Slide 2?
Great. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Amanda. All right. So we're now in between the third and the fourth observing run, and the third observing run ended with a catalog of 90 events and 6 what we call exceptional events that we kind of published separately and wanted to highlight. And we're now observing and are halfway through the fourth observing run. And we have just about doubled the sample and expect to, roughly speaking, triple the sample by the time we're done with this fourth observing run. So that's pretty exciting. We've gone from, first detection to hundreds of detections in a fairly short time, less than a decade, which is pretty astounding. So here I just wanted to give a visual thing because I think it's really amazing when you kind of see it. This was 01, 150914 was one of the sort of 2 to 3 detections we had in 01. This is 02. I think we were up to 11 at the end of 02, and we were really pleased with ourselves, and we had 170817. And then this was 03, where we just dramatically increased the sample, and we've by the end of 04, it'll be kind of triple. So, way past the graph here. So things are developing extremely nicely. And there's been this evolution in what we're really doing, what we think about in gravitational wave astronomy. From we have a few events like 150914 or 170817 or 190521, these kind of individual exciting events, and we lovingly analyze them and talk about them and write lots of papers, to now we really have populations. And a lot of the most interesting science is population-oriented science. What do we learn from the whole assembly of our detections? And so another just visual representation. This is a movie made by Zohair Doctor, inspired by a movie by Dan Fabrici, where he did this with planets, exoplanets. Now, it's just a visual way to say we've got a whole range of black holes of all different masses and mass ratios. And here's another kind of a periodic table version of this. And here are some of the kind of exciting individual events, but you can see there are really many events now. And so I'm not going to focus on any of the individual events. I'm just going to focus on what we're learning from the population, and that'll be Amanda's focus as well. So here's one example of the sort of things we now talk about, which I think is kind of one of the more interesting things we've measured so far with the LIGO data, and that's that the rate of binary black hole mergers evolves. So what I mean by that is, if you go back into the past, there were binary black holes were merging more often than they are today. And that's something we've sort of established with our data. So we can see far enough out, far enough back in time, because of course the gravitational waves travel at the speed of light, so that we can actually detect that the universe was more active in binary black hole mergers earlier than it is now. And that's fascinating for many reasons. I mean, it's just an amazing measurement to be able to do, but also it agrees with the intuition from people that model these populations that binary black holes should be related. The formation of binary black holes should be related to the formation of massive stars, which should be related in general to just the formation of stars in the universe. And the universe was much more active earlier in forming stars and has been getting quite boring as far as star formation is concerned for the last giga-year or so. So it used to be a much more exciting place. The universe is getting more dull, and that's true both in terms of forming stars and also in terms of merging black holes. So that's one of our results, and it's a population result. You can only get that by looking at the full assembly of 90 or so events that we have so far. This is another thing that we've been able to measure, and this is something that Amanda will talk about at length, and this is something she's really been very involved in kind of teasing out what the distribution is what we call the mass distribution for black holes in our binaries. And in particular, this is the mass distribution of the primary black hole, which is the more massive black hole in our binary. So you take every binary that we've detected, you pull out the more massive one, you ask for what its mass is, and then you make a histogram. But then because there are selection effects, you have to kind of undo those selection effects. We actually were more sensitive to bigger black holes, and you have to undo that effect. And you end up with this mass distribution. And so this is absolutely fascinating. This is kind of one of the most important things for us to measure, and it gives a lot of insight into how black holes are formed in the universe. And that's one of the big questions. One of the big things that LIGO hopes to address is this question of how does the universe make black holes, and how does it make black hole binaries? And one of our big clues is this distribution. And there's a lot of structure in this distribution, and that structure is critically important because it tells us something about the astrophysics. And for example, there appears to be kind of a break at the high mass end. You might notice that there's this is somewhere around, maybe 30 or 40, there's a peak, and then it starts to drop, and then it kind of levels, and then really drops off. And that feature is thought to be related to something called apparent stability supernova, but the connections don't seem to quite work, and it's just very exciting and interesting and a little confusing right now exactly what's going on there. And that's something that a lot of people are working on. But it's very important that we kind of understand what this distribution really is, and that these features are real. And you'll see there are lots, you can find bumps and wiggles depending on how you do the analysis. And one of the things that Amanda has developed is kind of a careful way to do this and to identify which bumps and wiggles are real, and which kind of are there what we call mass gaps, places where this distribution drops, and then maybe comes back on the other end. And there's just a lot of astrophysics going on here. Understanding this is critically important, but also because there are these features, there's this additional stuff we can do, and I'll get to that shortly. So this is the mass distribution of black holes. And so just to give you a sense, from the astrophysics side, there are lots of questions, lots of different ways we can imagine to make these black holes. So what I'm showing here are just, these are all very different channels by which you could make binary black holes. And they range from just, you have two kind of stars all alone in the universe, and they kind of spend their lives orbiting each other and eventually turn into black holes and then eventually merge. That's kind of one extreme. Or another extreme is you can have a region which is very dense, a globular cluster, for example, very dense with stars. They all turn into black holes. They're trading partners and getting very, it's a very active region. And then eventually binaries, kind of maybe by interacting with a triple, they end up merging. Those are completely viable formation channels for black holes we see. And we don't know which of these, if any, are appropriate for the distribution we have so far. So this is very, very active. Part of really being able to do this science is making sure your measurements are correct and that you understand what the mass distribution is that you're working with. All of these models try to explain the rates and the mass distributions that we see. Okay. And I should say this is wide open. So this is one of these areas where lots of people are this plot is getting more and more complicated. I would say before our first detection, this plot had just two things on it. It was isolated or dynamical. That was it. And now there are all these sub-channels and completely different channels. It's been very exciting just to watch this develop. Okay. So that's kind of what's going on with LIGO data. I'm going to now spend a little time talking about gravitational wave cosmology, because this is a big focus of what Amanda will be talking about as well. So I just want to kind of step back and lay some of the groundwork for gravitational wave cosmology. And in particular, that's one of the main things we do in gravitational waves and so we use these gravitational wave sources as standard sirens. And the basic idea there, which is due to Bernie Schutz, is that because we can understand the sources from GR, from first principles, in some sense, these sources are calibrated by general relativity, and you can use them, and by observing them, you can directly infer the distance to the sources. And so that's extremely powerful. You get a direct measure of luminosity distance, very hard to do with astronomical objects in general, but gravitational wave sources provide this. However, you don't get a redshift to the object. The redshift is degenerate with the mass. And so there's no way to break that degeneracy simply just from first principles. So you need to bring something else in to break that. And I should just, as an aside, say, this is, if you could use these, if you can measure distance and redshift, then you get something like the Hubble constant. Hubble constant is still a major topic in the field of cosmology. What precisely is the value of the Hubble constant? Is it 65 or 68 or 72? There are raging debates. People get extremely upset about this question. It's unclear. There's a real tension, and the tension could be pointing to new physics, a breakdown of our standard model lambda CDM, or it could just be systematics. And so anything that contributes to this is exciting. And it turns out, gravitational wave sources may be able to contribute because they have this very clean way of measuring distance, calibrated by GR. So I think, just because I'm running low on time, I'm going to kind of skip a lot of the details of each of these things. There's been a lot of development in this field. I'm just going to focus on one, which is kind of a newer version of standard sirens, which are called spectral sirens. And I'll just talk you through the basics of spectral sirens. So I'm going to just jump here to this. Okay. Here we go. Okay, so I'll talk about spectral sirens. You can ask me later if you want to hear about the others. The basic idea with spectral siren cosmology is that you might remember there's that mass distribution, and the mass distribution has bumps and wiggles. So if you take that mass distribution and you were to take all those sources and you would move them to high redshift, then all the mass is redshift, and you end up shifting that entire mass spectrum up in mass. And so if you know what the spectrum looks like, you can measure the fact that it's shifting, and that's a way to infer redshift. You get the distances basically for free from general relativity, and now you have both distance and redshift, and you can measure h of z, the kind of Hubble expansion. And that's extremely powerful. And so that's something, that we've kind of shown can do percent level measurements. I'll just skip this. This just shows it really, it's amazing. You can do this to very high redshift and get a very careful cosmological measurement. The main question here to do this, to measure the redshift using the shifting of the mass distribution, you have to know the shape of your distribution. And so you can ask, well, do we know the shape? I've just gone through this whole explanation saying that we don't understand the astrophysics of how these black holes are formed. So we don't know what this shape should be. So how can we actually do spectral sirens? How can we measure the redshift if we don't even know the shape? And this is the key thing that Amanda has done, is that she's shown that you can infer the shape simultaneously with inferring the cosmology, that the data itself allows you to kind of infer, if you use a nice flexible model, you let the data tell you the shape, you just kind of measure the cosmological shift of the shape, and you do it all simultaneously, and you don't need to know the astrophysics. And that's the DGRAV minus DAP part. We can use the gravitational wave sources, we can infer things about the expansion history of the universe and cosmology without needing to know all the messy astrophysics of what generates the shape and where are the bumps and wiggles exactly. You don't have to tell me that beforehand. I can infer it from the data simultaneously. And that's what Amanda has done, and that's what she'll talk about next. So this is, I actually just stole this from Amanda's talk, but she'll kind of go through these in turn, where she'll describe the mass distribution and some of the work she's done inferring aspects of the mass distribution, which has informed then her final project, that she'll talk about, which is a very recent paper where she's done this division DAP-free version of spectral siren cosmology. So I think okay, well, my computer is frozen, which is a great sign that it's time for me to stop, and I'll turn it over to Amanda. So maybe I'll just quickly introduce Amanda. Let me just stop sharing. Okay, so next up is Amanda Farah, who's a graduate student at the University of Chicago. And she's worked on a range of things. She'll be, of course, talking about these inferring mass distribution. She's been very involved in the LIGO collaboration and has been parts of a number of the high-profile LIGO paper results. And she's worked on a number of other things, including gamma ray bursts and various other technical things about the way we do our gravitational wave data analysis. And she was also just awarded the Blumenthal Prize, which we just found out today, which is, I think, the most prestigious prize we have in physics for graduate students. So congratulations, Amanda, because I haven't had a chance to congratulate you yet. And okay, with that, I'll pass it along. So Amanda, why don't you share your slides and get started.
Cool. Thank you so much for that very generous introduction, and for setting the stage so well, and for also coordinating your slide format to match my slide format. So yeah, thank you, Daniel. Right, so so going back to the title slide real quick. So yeah, we all know what DGRAV is. That's why we're here. It's a division of gravitational physics. DAP is the division of astrophysics. And so now I'll just go into more detail of how to take DAP out of the gravitational wave cosmology equation and measure the expansion of the universe with general relativity alone, using some cool data analysis tricks. Yeah, and to do that, and hopefully my computer doesn't crash with this slide, I'll spend some time giving some background information on spectral sirens and the gravitational wave source mass spectrum. Then I'll talk about how we identify useful spectral features and the compact binary mass distribution. I'll do this by first talking about finding features at the low mass end of the spectrum, which we did in this first publication. Then I'll talk about a paper that deals with understanding the robustness of features previously identified at medium and higher mass parts of the spectrum. And then we're going to use all of the information we learned from these two papers and the final one that I'll talk about, which is about doing spectral sirens even when you're not sure what caused the features that exist in the spectrum. I'll end with what we can expect with future data sets, including those from the current observing run of the LIGO-Virgo-Hagra collaboration, as well as with future gravitational wave detectors. Also, I just made this animation to keep you entertained while I was talking through this roadmap, but I want to make clear that I know this is not how gravitational wave propagation looks like for all the relativists in the audience. And this is also not an accurate representation of the detector response. So hopefully you still trust me to do precision gravitational wave science after seeing that animation. Okay, so as Daniel touched on, there are multiple ways to do cosmology with gravitational waves. I'm going to focus on spectral sirens for this talk. And I'm interested in spectral sirens specifically because it doesn't require any electromagnetic observations. It's entirely based on gravitational wave detections. And that means it has relatively few systematic uncertainties since gravitational waves are very clean messengers. They don't get reddened by intervening matter. We know exactly what the waveform should look like based off of general relativity. So they're like very pristine. And that's great because the Hubble tension that Daniel was talking about, which is a discrepancy in the value of the Hubble constant when measured with local objects versus the cosmic microwave background has a raging debate on whether that tension is caused by new physics or just systematic uncertainties. So the directness and relative lack of systematics in spectral sirens is really appealing. The gravitational wave only aspect of the spectral siren method also means that we can use the full reach of gravitational wave detectors. So we aren't limited to the distances to which electromagnetic transients are detectable or to which galaxy surveys are complete. So what I mean by that is you can see in this plot, I'm showing the expansion history of the universe, h, as a function of redshift. Each blue line here is a potential value of h of z obtained using the spectral siren method applied to a dataset characteristic of the next LIGO-Virgo-Cagra or LVK observing run. So the further apart these lines are from each other, the more possibilities the data allow, which means the less constraining they are. So you'll notice that we're actually most sensitive to z equals 0.9. Electromagnetic counterparts are detectable at z equals 0.1, if that, probably a lot closer. So spectral sirens goes much farther than electromagnetic counterparts. So in all, when compared to other methods, spectral sirens are unique for both their reach and for their accuracy. But as Daniel explained, in order to do spectral sirens, we need the mass distribution of gravitational wave sources. So I'll spend a little bit of time on that first. So the mass distribution describes the population of gravitational wave source masses. We get the mass distribution by combining the masses of all individual gravitational wave detections. We do this with something called hierarchical Bayesian analysis, which allows us to infer all of the individual masses simultaneously with the whole population of masses. And we actually do this for masses, spins, and redshifts all together, but I'm just focusing on the masses today. When we combine all the different events, we have to take into account the fact that we're actually missing a lot of events. Because farther events have lower gravitational wave amplitudes and less massive events also have lower gravitational wave amplitudes, we preferentially detect closer, higher mass systems. And so that results in a very big difference between our detected population, which you can see in the dashed line here, and the true underlying or astrophysical population, which is shown in the solid line. Fortunately, because we know general relativity, we know which kinds of events we're missing, which means we understand the biases introduced by this selection effect as a function of all of the parameters of each system. And we know that very well. This is yet another reason why we know why gravitational waves are clean probes. So I think the fact that we can even get the solid line from the data is a huge thing that people in the gravitational wave community often take for granted. And people outside the community often don't realize that we're actually getting an underlying distribution. So, okay, now that we know how to infer the population, let's talk about the features in that population that we can use for cosmology. So this is a cartoon of a possible mass distribution. Between 1 and about 3 solar masses, we're describing the population of neutron stars, and above that is the population of black holes. Each of these potential bumps and dips is a spectral feature that will redshift, which is what we want. And I'll use this cartoon throughout the talk to keep track of which part of the mass spectrum we're discussing. So first is going to be a close-up of the mass distribution at low compact object masses, right between neutron stars and black holes. So what do we know about this region of mass space? Well, we know there's a maximum mass that a neutron star can withstand before it collapses into a black hole. That means there's something special that happens at that particular mass, which may give us something to work with. So we're going to try to find something there. To do that, we're fitting a super simple model. So we have 2 power laws, alpha 1 and alpha 2, with a break between them at m break. We fit for the slope of those power laws as well as the location of the break. We find very strong evidence that a break exists because we find that alpha 1 does not equal alpha 2 to a very high credibility. And we also find the break to be at around 2.45 solar masses, which is right where most predictions for the maximum allowed neutron star mass live. So there's definitely a feature there, and we feel like it's well motivated that there's a feature there. Another thing we can ask is the maximum neutron star mass the same as the minimum black hole mass? Or is there some separation between the two of them? If there was a separation, this would give us two features for the price of one. So we go look for that separation with a slightly more complicated model. And we find some evidence for a separation between the minimum black hole mass and the maximum neutron star mass, which causes a gap in the spectrum between the two. So the evidence, you can also see the slide, right? My computer just glitched.
Yeah.
You can see like two plots on one side. Okay, great. Thanks. Right, okay, yeah. So the evidence for a separation between the neutron star maximum mass and the black hole minimum mass isn't as strong, but there's probably something there. And one side note, if you're an astrophysicist studying binary stars or black hole formation, a lower limit on the mass of black holes and binaries is super interesting all by itself. A lot of people have spent lots of time trying to figure out if this minimum black hole mass or a gap between neutron star and black hole masses exists or not, and if so, what that limit is. So we really want more low mass detections to figure this out. Okay, moving on. So we just established the existence of some features at the low mass end. And so now let's look at the high mass end where binary black holes live. These are the majority of our sources because we're more sensitive to higher mass systems. So we have a lot more data to constrain this part of the spectrum. So we again do another population analysis of the binary black holes that we've observed. So what I'm showing here is the result of 3 different analyses on the same exact data. The gray is an analysis with a very simple model, and the blue added 1 level of complexity, and the orange adds a lot of complexity, making it the most flexible model. Besides all finding the same maximum black hole mass, which is great and useful for spectral sirens, besides that, these 3 analyses clearly get different results. The more flexible models are finding more features, and that could either be because there are more features in the data that the other models can't capture, or because the flexible models are overfitting. What I mean by overfitting is that even if your true distribution is smooth, like this gray line, if you draw a finite number of samples from it and then bin up those samples in histogram, there's always going to be bins that are taller and shorter than the continuum. We've all seen this before. It's just a finite sample effect. If we had infinite samples, those bins would follow the gray line perfectly. So maybe our very flexible models are just picking up on this finite sample effect. Oh yeah, those are the too high and the too low bins. So we care a lot about if this is happening. We don't want astrophysicists to waste their time trying to figure out what processes cause these bumps and wiggles if they are just statistical fluctuations. Also, for us, fake features won't redshift because they're not physical. So we only want to use the real features for cosmology. We can figure out if this additional structure picked up on by the more flexible models is robust by finding out how often you would see bumps like this if the underlying distribution was actually bump-free. So for example, if the underlying distribution was like the gray line here. So we did just that. We generated catalogs of gravitational wave events, just like ours, but with a known underlying distribution that didn't have any structure. The black line in this figure is what I'm talking about. We then fit them using the same analysis that was done on the real data, specifically using the power law plus spline model, which was developed by Bruce Edelman. We did this a few hundred times, And we found that even though our simulated data came from a bump-free underlying population, when we fit the data with a flexible model, we found bumps. And some of those bumps were just as tall as those that we found in the original data, which is pretty worrisome. So we then asked how often the featureless catalogs had bumps that appeared as statistically significant as each bump in the real data set. I'm not going to go into the details right now, but if you're interested in how we assess the significance of features in our mock catalogs versus the real data set and how we compared the two, feel free to ask me after. The main conclusion, though, after all of our tests is that the only two features only these two features with green check marks cannot be reproduced in any way by the catalog simulated from a featureless population. Besides those, though, the bumps and wiggles you're seeing in the orange band were easy to reproduce with featureless catalogs and therefore could totally be due to random clustering or model systematics. So they could be statistical fluctuations. So I wouldn't recommend trying to do astrophysics or spectral sirens with them. If, though, one of these middle bumps is actually real, it will become apparent when we get more data. So quick notes about the real features. The 35 solar mass peak is actually really hard to explain astrophysically. I wouldn't say that there's conclusive evidence that it comes from one formation hypothesis versus another, so that we don't know which circle of the Venn diagram that Daniel showed causes this peak. As for the 10th solar mass peak, there is an astrophysical story we can tell that makes it not super surprising, but I also wouldn't say that it's definitively explained. Since I promised no astrophysics in this talk, I won't go into the details of those different theories, but you can also feel free to ask me about that after. The point, though, is that even though we know which features actually exist in the data, we don't know which astrophysical processes caused them. So based off our studies of the mass distribution, we found 4 robust features that we are sure we can use for spectral sirens. Of these, 3 are useful in the current data set, but all 4 will be imperative for next generation detectors. So now that we have those, we can go back to spectral sirens. We're going to use the 3 features that are useful for current data, which are, represented in this distribution. I'll simulate data from this distribution and then try to recover it, as well as the value of the Hubble constant that I used to simulate the data. So in all of these slides, the truth that I simulated data from is going to be indicated by a solid white line. So this process works. Our inferred mass distribution matches the truth very well, and our inferred H0 is bang on true value. That's great because it means that we're able to identify features in the source mass distribution and figure out how they redshifted. You might think you need to know, though, where these features are ahead of time in order to do this fit, because their locations are supposed to tell you the source frame mass. In this case, we're using a, quote, correct model in the sense that the shape of the true distribution is contained within the shapes possible with the model that we're using. And I knew what model to use because I simulated the data from it. If you use an incorrect mass distribution, the question is, would you get biased measurements of H0? So we tried that here. In orange, I'm showing the incorrect mass distribution. It's a model that does not have the true shape of the mass distribution in the fit. It doesn't have a bump in it. It just has a kink and a power law. And you can see that this model is doing its best to fit the mass distribution on the left, but it's not getting it quite right because it just can't. These 2 models are making different and strong assumptions about the astrophysics of binary black hole formation, even if we don't have the physical understanding to describe what those assumptions are. So for this study, we know the green model makes the right assumptions, and we know that the orange model makes the wrong ones. But when we have real data, not simulated data, we're not going to know that. On the right, this results in a biased measurement of the Hubble constant when you're using the wrong model. So the true value is offset from the mean of the posterior by more than 3 sigma. This is potentially really bad because in reality, we don't have access to the truth. And as I mentioned earlier, we don't have a good theoretical grip on the shape of the mass distribution. We don't know even which physical processes in that Venn diagram that Daniel showed contribute to the mass distribution, let alone which part of the Venn diagram is most important. So does this mean that our very clean, supposedly GR-only cosmological probe is unusable because we don't know complicated astrophysics? To answer this question, we developed a flexible model for the mass distribution using a Gaussian process. For our purposes, a Gaussian process is a prior on smooth functions. It's kind of like a set of smooth functions. This is really nice because it gives us a clear algorithmic way to draw a wide variety of smooth functions with a known prior. This is useful for many things, and Gaussian processes have been used a lot in data analysis problems, data science broadly, and including GW data analysis specifically. So here's an example of one draw from a Gaussian process. So one of the many functions contained in the prior. It's a smooth function of x, but otherwise looks pretty random. Since these are arbitrary smooth functions, though, we can use them to model the shape of the mass distribution because that's also a smooth function. Here are several draws from the Gaussian process. So several samples from the population's prior distribution. And we're going to use these for inference. And a simplified way to think about how that inference works is we basically draw a function from the Gaussian process. So we draw one of these lines. We ask, is the data well described by coming from this distribution? If it is, we keep it. And if not, we throw it away and we draw another one. After the inference, we end up with this. So we started out with incoherent squiggles, but because there are so many possibilities for those random squiggles, the process can approximate many shapes very well, including the form of our mass distribution. And it does successfully do that. And that's what I mean by it being a flexible model. In this way, we're putting in very little prior information about the shape of the mass distribution. The Gaussian process has no prior preference to be one particular thing over another, and the data are telling us what shape to approximate. So this is how we end up getting around our need to know astrophysics and how we take DAP out of the equation. There's no astrophysics in this model. It's just squiggles. So now we're going to apply this to spectral sirens. So this is where we were before with our correct and incorrect models. I turned the individual lines into contours that contain 90% of the probability of those lines. And with our flexible Gaussian process-based mass distribution, this is what we get. The true distribution is recovered almost as well as with the correct parametric model, and we get an unbiased measurement of the Hubble parameter. It's consistent with the true value within 1 sigma. So even though the model's super flexible, it's still able to recover cosmological parameters. And this shows that we need zero prior theoretical information about the shape of the mass distribution. All we need is data that exhibits features in that distribution. And we've additionally removed systematic bias based off of mismodeling of the population. So the point of this is that even when you don't know the complicated astrophysics causing features in the mass distribution, you can still learn about cosmology completely agnostically. So in this case, it's fine not to know the truth as long as you don't pretend that you do. So in summary, gravitational waves can be used as standard sirens. Spectral sirens are a specific case of standard sirens that use the mass spectrum of gravitational wave sources to avoid electromagnetic counterparts. 4 robust features exist in the gravitational wave source mass spectrum, and so long as these features exist, we do not need to know why they are there in order to use them for spectral sirens. Further, Gaussian processes are a great tool to remove bias from choosing the wrong model for the mass distribution. So where are we now and where are we going? Here's a schematic of how far back in time gravitational wave detectors can see compared to the fractional composition of the universe. The currently public data from our 3rd observing run had 70 high significance events. So those were the spinning things in the orrery that Daniel showed. With this, we could probe the local universe. Now the LVK is halfway through our 4th observing run. And since this observing run started, we've already more than doubled the number of public alerts since our detectors were last on. Now that we're in the second half of the observing run, we have the Virgo detector on as well, which means we should have better localized events and better luminosity distance constraints. The farthest event we can see in our current observing run is during matter-dark energy equality, but we're most sensitive to closer redshifts where dark energy dominates. In about 3 years, hopefully, we'll start the 5th observing run. At that time, LIGO will be sensitive to sources 2 times farther away, meaning roughly 8 times larger volumes, so a lot more sources. We expect to see over 1,000 events. We're going to be probing a super interesting time when we switch from matter to dark energy domination, which is a great way to probe the nature of dark energy, which is one of the most pressing open questions in cosmology right now. And after that, we hope to have another generation of detectors that will see all merging stellar mass binaries in the universe. A quick comment about this plot. So if this were a DAP audience, I'd show this plot in redshift or co-moving volume, and the change from 05, the orange line, to next generation detectors would look way more impressive. But since this is DGRAV, I'm doing it in look back time. So the increase looks a lot more marginal, but it's actually a really huge deal, next generation detectors. This is going to give us a continuous measure of the universe's expansion from the time when binary black holes first started merging until now. That's really incredible and unprecedented, and we're going to be able to directly measure all cosmological parameters that govern the universe's expansion. And again, this will be all without most of the messy systematics that come with electromagnetic observations. So I'm super excited for this and grateful for all of the people working on the instrumentation of next generation detectors and everything that goes into planning next generation detectors. Okay, with that, we can take any questions.
So thank you to both of you for 2 really very beautiful and super interesting talks. So thank you again. That was great. And I think we already have one question from Lorena. Lorena, you go ahead.
Yes, thank you for 2 really great talks. I have a question about the different types of models, like the flexible, the simple, the more, and the most flexible models. So you mentioned how, if you look at the most flexible, you could have overfitting possibly. Is there a way to actually know if you're overfitting, or do you have to try to find other ways to either prove or disprove a most flexible model?
Yeah, I guess I'll answer this, but Daniel, if you want to answer it, just tell me. So yeah, okay, great question. So there are many different tests you can do to find out if you're overfitting. One common test that people use is Bayes factor, so like a Bayesian evidence of like all these different models, so they can compare the different ones to see which is a better fit to the data, and that should kind of penalize more complicated models, but those are not actually very reliable and they're very dependent on priors. So I would argue that the best way to figure out if you're overfitting is by doing a simulation campaign like this one, where we take a model that or we take a distribution where like the only way you could get bumps out of it is by overfitting, and see if you get those bumps. So that's why we did it this way. So I think that's the most reliable way, but yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Keith has a question, I believe.
Yeah, thank you for the really excellent talks. I just had a question regarding the Gaussian process that you brought up at the end. So maybe I'm understanding, but how exactly do you choose the smooth basis functions for this process?
Yeah, great question. Let me see if I have an extra slide on this. Okay, no, I didn't put it in this presentation, but yeah, so we actually fit the smoothing parameter. Yeah, I didn't talk about this at all. So how smooth it is a separate parameter. So these squiggles could be way more spread out if it was a lot smoother. And that's a separate parameter that governs the nature of the Gaussian process. We call that a hyper parameter. So the Gaussian process itself is full of hyperparameters, and then this governs the Gaussian process. So that's hyper. We fit that with the data as well. So the data is actually telling us how smooth the Gaussian process should be. And we choose like our priors for that smoothing parameter in a way that penalizes too much complexity. So we're trying to get around the overfitting that we were just talking about in other models. We don't want the Gaussian process to latch on to every single possible bump and wiggle. So we put a prior on it to penalize like a super complicated model, but we still fit it along with the rest of the data.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you very much.
Now we have a question in the chat box. Alan, do you want to read it yourself, or otherwise I'm happy to read it out? Or
I'll read it. So you
You
showed
got it.
some results, a posterior on H0 with an H0 true value superimposed. So I assume that's simulation. And I'm just wondering if you've done the analysis on real data.
Yeah, it is simulation. That's totally right. Because we wanted to do simulation to see how bad we would be if we used the wrong model, and also to know if the Gaussian process is like actually recovering the right model. We have not yet done this on real data. Yeah, so the reason for that is that even though there's more events in this, real data is a lot more complicated. So you need a lot more samples. You need a lot more PE samples per event than when you use simulated data. Sorry, this is getting kind of jargony, but we basically, it's actually going to take a little bit more computational development to apply this to real data, because this is a very memory intensive process. The fitting procedure for this is very memory intensive. So we're actively working on ways to make this more computationally feasible so we can apply it to real data, because those are much larger data sets. Yeah, but that is a plan for sure.
Thanks. If I can just follow up for a moment. So you said that the problem that you're encountering is a technical one, computing. Are there any potential problems associated with the fact that real data rarely looks a whole lot like simulated data, just because detectors are imperfect? And in particular, the big thing that you always have to worry about is this is the true distribution. There's a sensitivity estimate that has to be made. That's made using simulations. It's imperfect, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. So I think if I were concerned with perfectly recovering like the true, like if I were concerned with like every single intricacy of the mass distribution, getting the selection effect exactly right, that would be a concern. But so long as my sensitivity estimate for my injections matches my sensitivity estimate for my simulated data, this should be accurate. It just has to be self-consistent. So as long as everything is simulated, it should be fine. So I'm not concerned about that. And also the way that we're simulating the data adds in like all of the correlations that you would be worried about. So the correlation between masses and redshifts of individual systems, the correlations between primary and secondary mass of individual systems. The way that we're simulating the data does take all of that into account. So I'm not super worried about this, especially because the point is to prove that features redshift. That's a problem that's pretty far removed from the details of the detector. I don't know if Daniel, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Hi, Alan. Yeah, and it's a great question. And basically, what Amanda said is absolutely correct, that we're doing a lot of work, and just to do the mass distribution, we do a lot of work to try to incorporate these things. But one thing that makes this particularly robust is that what we're looking for here is an effect which causes the entire mass distribution to shift as one. And so what you would worry about is if somewhere in this process of doing selection and, the potential biases that creep in and various, correlations or whatever it is, instrumental or analysis wise, that somehow that causes the entire mass distribution to shift, and shift kind of systematically with more distant sources, and then and that seems less likely. And so in a sense, unless it's a very truly evil universe or a very evil set of biases, it's probably subdominant. I mean, that's the intuition, but I'm sure you could come up with something we would have to worry about. So, but that's why the kind of approach works generally.
I'm sorry, one more quick follow-up. Okay, so you mentioned the evil universe. Well, the universe isn't really evil, but it does evolve, and this mass distribution will evolve. Comments?
Yeah. Sorry, one more. Sorry, my slides are not advancing. Oh yeah. So yeah, I just wanted to show this plot on the left. It's from a paper by Jose and Daniel, so I'm not showing the evolving mass distribution here, but I am showing the H of Z constraints. And this H of Z constraint comes from a mass distribution that actually does evolve astrophysically with redshift. So different features in the mass distribution, like, some of them move. I can't explain this without doing a dance. So if you look at my hands, with increasing redshift, some of the features move. It's also possible that some of the features like increase in prominence and decrease in prominence. That is fine, because cosmology monotonically moves everything to higher detector frame mass. It monotonically moves everything to higher redshift. And astrophysics would, it's extremely rare for astrophysics to be able to do that. They're totally different processes governing the different features. And it would be very bizarre for them to all move at exactly the same place. If you only had one feature,
that
in the
evil
distribution,
universe.
that would be a very evil universe. Yeah. If you only had one feature, that would be a lot easier to replicate, but they show in this paper, I don't know why I'm speaking, Daniel should definitely be talking about this. They show in this paper that as long as you have multiple features, you can completely break that degeneracy. So yeah, I think it should be okay.
Thanks very much.
I think you probably mentioned this, but I just missed it. But is there any chance of measuring time dependence of Hubble constant? In other words, not constant. So reaching further back in time, dealing with both the evolution of the mass distribution and the evolution of H naught. Once you get more gravitational wave signals, is that an ultimate target that could be achieved?
Should I take, okay, so I'm not fully sure if I understand the question, so I'll just check. Do you mean, so this thing on the left is H of Z, so like it's not the Hubble constant that's changing, but it's the Hubble parameter, I guess. So it's the expansion rate of the universe changes as a function of redshift, and we are directly probing that.
Okay,
but maybe you're asking about something else?
No, that's what I'm asking about. I think I just missed this part of the talk. So like at what point would you be able to say whether or not there's been a change or, detecting the change?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just trying to pull up the right slide for this. Maybe this one. So in 05, we'll already be able to detect this. And actually people are measuring this right now in current data, but the measurements are not very well constrained. So we're measuring H of Z, and we do this by measuring, we have a model for how H of Z should work, just like our models for the mass distribution. And this model has two parameters that it has many parameters, but we vary only two of them, H naught and omega matter, so the matter density of the universe. Omega matter like changes the slope of this curve, and H naught changes the y-intercept, roughly speaking. And so we're already able to constrain the slope of this curve. We're already able to constrain omega matter. So I think that shows that we're able to see that H of Z is evolving.
Right, but so are you assuming that omega lambda is constant?
In this fit I am, yeah. In this fit I am, but you could change the model if you wanted to and do the same exact thing.
I guess that was the thing I didn't really articulate it clearly that I was really curious about. Would this give a handle on whether the dark energy is actually just a cosmological constant or is evolving?
Oh yeah, you could totally do that with this. We haven't done it. But that's just, you just let another parameter vary in your fit. Yeah. Daniel,
Right, and so when will you have enough data to actually say something about that?
I mean, it depends on how many other parameters you want to fix. So if you're okay with fixing H naught and omega matter, you could probably figure that out right now with current data. But yeah, I think if you wanted to do the full analysis, if you wanted to constrain like W, the dark energy equation of state, I think you might need next generation detectors, but Daniel should correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. So with the next generation, you just nail down this curve at the percent level out to well past the matter cosmology constant sort of transition. But for 04, we're just barely measuring the Hubble constant, and for 05, we start to kind of nail down, if you like, the derivative, as Amanda said. So you can think of that as, we're now constraining in the model of flat universes, we're getting an independent constraint on omega matter, for example. But then to really get out to high redshift and see deviations from lambda CDM curves, that you need the next generation.
Thank you.
Any more quick questions? Because we are already past 3, so maybe it's a good time to wrap this up. Well, in that case, I suggest we all unmute ourselves and just applaud our speakers. Thank our speakers again for really 2 beautiful talks. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for attending, and thanks for the great questions.
Yeah, thank you all.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.